At 11:14 on the morning of April 26, 1999, Jill Dando picked up her phone and made a booking. 2 tickets to Mamma Mia at the Prince Edward Theatre, a surprise birthday gift for the man she was about to marry. She was happy, settled, 5 months away from her wedding to a successful surgeon. She had just made him breakfast before he left for work, and now she was tying up loose ends at her old house in Fulham before heading into the BBC to present the evening news. 18 minutes later, she was dead. A single bullet to the head, fired at point-blank range on her own doorstep in broad daylight on a quiet residential street in one of London's most affluent neighbourhoods. Her neighbour heard her cry out, but he didn't hear a gunshot. No one did. The killer had pressed the weapon so hard against her skull that her own body muffled the sound. She was found 14 minutes after the attack, slumped against her front door, car keys still in her hand. By the time paramedics reached Charing Cross Hospital, there was nothing they could do. Britain's most beloved television presenter was pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. What followed was the largest murder investigation the country had seen since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. Over 2,500 people were interviewed, more than 1,000 statements were taken, 7,000 separate lines of inquiry were opened, and at the end of it all, police arrested a man who lived half a mile from her house, convicted him on the strength of a single microscopic particle of gunpowder residue, and sent him to prison for life. He spent 8 years behind bars. Then his conviction was overturned, the evidence was declared unsafe, he walked free, and the real murderer was never found. This is the story of how Britain failed one of its most famous daughters, how the justice system imprisoned an innocent man while the real murderer vanished into thin air, and how, more than 25 years later, someone out there still knows exactly what happened that Monday morning. If you're new here and you want to see more stories like this one, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps more than you know, and it means you won't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Jill Dando wasn't born into fame. She grew up in Weston-super-Mare, a quiet seaside town in Somerset, far removed from the glitz of London broadcasting. At 3 years old, doctors discovered a hole in her heart and a blocked pulmonary artery. She underwent open heart surgery before most children learned to ride a bike. It was the kind of start that could have defined her life. Instead, she refused to let it. She began her career at the Western Mercury, the same local newspaper where her father and brother worked, a trainee reporter learning the basics, nothing glamorous. But Jill had something that couldn't be taught, a warmth that came through every time she spoke, a natural ease in front of people that made them trust her instantly. By 1985, she'd moved to BBC Radio Devon. 3 years later, she made the jump to national television, and once she arrived, she never stopped climbing. Breakfast time, the 1 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, holiday, songs of praise. She became one of the most recognized faces in the country, the kind of presenter who felt like a friend sitting in your living room. In 1997, the BBC named her their Personality of the Year. She was 35 years old and at the absolute peak of her career. But it was Crimewatch that would define her legacy in ways no one could have predicted. The show was simple in concept, but powerful in execution. Each episode reconstructed unsolved crimes and appealed directly to the public for information. Tips flooded in, cases got solved. Over its 25-year run, Crimewatch helped capture 57 murderers, 53 rapists, and 18 paedophiles. Jill became the face of that success, the woman who brought criminals to justice from behind a desk. The irony would later prove unbearable. Off-screen, her life was finally falling into place. After a long relationship with a BBC executive ended, she met Alan Farthing through a mutual friend in late 1997. He was a consultant gynecologist, recently separated from his wife. They fell hard and fast. By January 1999, just weeks after his divorce was finalized, they announced their engagement. The wedding was set for September 25th. Colleagues described them as deeply in love. Jill had spent years building her career. Now she was ready to build a life. She never got the chance. The morning of April 26, 1999, was unremarkable in every way. Jill woke up at Alan Farthing's house in Chiswick, made him breakfast and kissed him goodbye before he left for work. She had errands to run. The Fulham house she'd owned for years was on the market, and she needed to collect some papers. She also wanted to book those theatre tickets, a small surprise for the man she loved. She climbed into her blue BMW convertible and drove the short distance to Gowan Avenue. It was a route she barely took anymore. She spent most of her nights at Alan's place now. The Fulham house was just a loose end waiting to be tied up. She parked outside at approximately 11:30 a.m. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. As Jill approached her front door, a man grabbed her from behind. He forced her down onto the doorstep, pressing her face against the tile. Then he placed the barrel of a gun against her left temple and pulled the trigger once. A single 9mm bullet entered her skull. She died almost instantly. The weapon was pressed so tightly against her head that it acted as its own suppressor. The shot was muffled. Her neighbour, Richard Hughes, heard her cry out, a sound he later described as being like someone greeting a friend. But he heard no gunshot. Nobody on the street did. The killer stood up and walked away. Witnesses would later recall seeing a man in a dark suit moving briskly down Fulham Palace Road toward the tube station. One woman said he was running like his life depended on it, but at the time nobody thought anything of it. 14 minutes passed before a neighbour discovered her body. She was slumped against her front door, her car keys still clutched in her hand. The 999 call that followed was frantic. The caller recognized her immediately. "Confidentially, it looks like it's Jill Dando," he said. Then, moments later, "Oh my God, no, I don't think she's alive." Paramedics rushed her to Charing Cross Hospital, but there was no saving her. At 1:03 p.m., Jill Dando was pronounced dead. She was 37 years old. She was supposed to present the 6 o'clock news that evening. Her face was already on the cover of that week's Radio Times. Back at the scene, forensic officers recovered a single spent cartridge. The bullet showed signs of crimping, a modification technique associated with Yugoslav ammunition. The weapon itself appeared to be a reactivated or modified handgun, possibly a converted replica. Not the tool of a random attacker, not the choice of an amateur. This had the precision of something else entirely. And that's where the story gets darker. Within hours of Jill's death, the Metropolitan Police launched Operation Oxborough. It would become the biggest murder investigation Britain had seen in nearly 2 decades. Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell took the lead, coordinating 3 separate teams of detectives alongside criminologists, psychologists, and forensic specialists. The numbers alone tell you how seriously they took this. Over 2,500 people interviewed, more than 1,000 formal statements, 7,000 lines of inquiry opened and pursued. The pressure was immense. This wasn't just a murder. This was the murder of a national icon. The public wanted answers. The media demanded them. But answers were hard to come by. The first calls came almost immediately, within hours of the shooting. Men with Eastern European accents phoned the BBC claiming responsibility. One caller told a news executive directly, "Your Prime Minister Blair butchered innocent young people. We butcher back." Another warned that 14 more would die. The message was clear. This was revenge for NATO. Just 3 days before Jill's murder, British and American warplanes had bombed the Radio-Television Serbia headquarters in Belgrade. 16 people died in that strike, and 3 weeks before that, Jill had presented a BBC appeal for Kosovan Albanian refugees fleeing Serbian persecution. She'd called Kosovo a former Yugoslavian region, a description that would have enraged Serbian nationalists. The timing seemed too precise to ignore. Then there was Slavko Čuruvija, a Serbian opposition journalist who had criticized the Milosevic regime. He was shot dead outside his apartment in Belgrade just 15 days before Jill. The method was identical: grabbed from behind, forced to the ground, single bullet to the head at close range. In 2019, 4 members of the Serbian Secret Service were convicted of his murder. The verdicts were later overturned on appeal, sparking international outrage. 2 journalists, 2 countries, 2 executions carried out the same way, 15 days apart. Police investigated the Serbian connection seriously. Intelligence reports from the National Criminal Intelligence Service suggested that the warlord Jelko Ragnatovic, better known as Arkan, may have ordered a hit on the BBC's Director General, Sir John Birt. When Birt's security was increased, the theory went, the target shifted to unguarded Jill Dando instead. Arkan himself was assassinated 9 months later in a Belgrade hotel lobby. But proving any of this was impossible. No hard evidence emerged. No credible claim of responsibility was ever verified. The Serbian theory remained just that, a theory. So detectives widened their search. They looked at Crimewatch. Over the years, the show had put hundreds of criminals behind bars. Was this revenge from the underworld? Police identified a connection to Kenneth No, a notorious gangster convicted of a road rage murder after a Crimewatch appeal. Intelligence reports mentioned a man called Joe, a barman in Tenerife with alleged ties to No, who supposedly traveled to the UK specifically to carry out the hit. Joe was never found. They looked at obsessed fans. Jill received thousands of letters, some of them deeply disturbing. Detectives identified 140 individuals with unhealthy fixations on her. Her brother told police she'd mentioned some guy pestering her in the days before her death, but nothing concrete materialized. They looked at mistaken identity. A theory emerged that a French businessman under investigation for serious offenses had hired a hitman to kill a different blonde BBC journalist who also lived in Fulham. The killer got the wrong woman. It sounded far-fetched, but police couldn't rule it out. Every lead went cold. Every theory hit a wall. Months passed. The pressure mounted. And then, in December 1999, a dog walker found something along the shore of the Thames. A black 9mm automatic pistol wrapped in newspaper, similar to the type of weapon believed to have killed Jill. It was never conclusively linked to her murder. The investigation was drowning in possibilities and starving for proof. And then, finally, police found someone they could arrest.
On May 25, 2000, over a year after the murder, police arrested a man named Barry George. He lived less than half a mile from Jill's house. He had a history of erratic behavior, sexual offenses, and an obsession with fame. To investigators drowning in dead ends, he looked like the answer they'd been searching for. Barry George was not a normal man. Born in 1960, he'd attended a school for children with educational and behavioral problems and left at 16 with no qualifications. He briefly worked as a messenger at BBC Television Centre. He tried to join the Metropolitan Police and was rejected. He joined the Territorial Army in 1980 and was discharged a year later. His criminal record was troubling. In 1981, he was convicted of indecent assault. In 1983, he was convicted of attempted rape and served 18 months in prison. He had a documented history of following women and inserting himself into their lives uninvited. He also lived in a fantasy world. He adopted personas based on famous people. For a time, he called himself Steve Majors and claimed to be a stuntman. He once attempted to jump over 4 double-decker buses on roller skates. He failed. Later, he started calling himself Barry Bulsara, telling people he was Freddie Mercury's cousin. Mercury's real surname was Bulsara. There was no family connection whatsoever. When police searched his flat, they found photographs of celebrities, newspaper clippings about Jill Dando's murder, 4 copies of the BBC's commemorative magazine issue about her death. They found pictures of George posing with a blank firing pistol. To investigators, this looked like obsession. This looked like motive. But there was a problem. Despite his collections of photos and clippings about various TV personalities, police found nothing specifically connecting George to Jill Dando before her death. No stalking, no letters, no evidence he'd ever tried to contact her. The case against him rested on something else entirely. A single microscopic particle of firearm discharge residue found in the pocket of his coat. One speck, invisible to the naked eye, discovered a full year after the murder. Prosecutors argued this particle matched residue found at the crime scene. It was, they claimed, the forensic link that proved Barry George had fired the gun that killed Jill Dando. The defense pushed back hard. Michael Mansfield, one of Britain's most respected barristers, argued the particle could have come from anywhere. Cross-contamination from armed police officers who arrested George. Environmental transfer. A year is a long time. A single particle means almost nothing. Mansfield went further. He presented an alternative theory to the jury. Jill Dando wasn't killed by a local misfit. She was assassinated by a Serbian hitman on orders from the warlord Arkan. This was political. This was professional. Barry George didn't have the intelligence or the capability to plan and execute something like this. Neuropsychological testing revealed George had an IQ of just 75, placing him in the lowest 5% of the population. Experts testified he lacked the cognitive ability to carry out a meticulously planned murder and escape without leaving evidence. 2 witnesses had seen a man near Jill's house on the morning of the killing. Neither could identify Barry George in a lineup. None of it mattered. On July 2, 2001, the jury convicted Barry George of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom erupted. The media declared justice served. Britain finally had its answer. Except it didn't.
Barry George sat in prison while doubts about his conviction grew louder. In 2002, his legal team launched an appeal. They challenged the identification evidence and the reliability of the forensic case against him. The Court of Appeal dismissed it. George remained behind bars. But the questions wouldn't go away. In 2006, new evidence emerged. A neuropsychiatrist named Michael Kopelman examined George and concluded that his mental disabilities made him incapable of planning and executing such a crime. George wasn't cunning, he wasn't calculating. He was a man who lived in delusion, who struggled with basic reasoning, who couldn't have orchestrated a professional-style killing and walked away clean. Then came the BBC Panorama documentary. Journalist Raphael Rowe, himself a victim of wrongful conviction, investigated the case and exposed serious weaknesses in the original trial. The program raised uncomfortable questions about how the police had handled evidence, how the prosecution had presented its case, and whether an innocent man was rotting in a cell while the real killer walked free. The forensic evidence came under the harshest scrutiny. That single particle of firearm discharge residue, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Forensic scientist Angela Shaw examined the evidence and delivered a damning assessment. One particle, found a year after the murder, in a coat pocket that could have picked up contamination from dozens of sources. Her conclusion was blunt. A single particle a year later in a coat pocket could not link Barry George to the shooting. The science that convicted him was falling apart. In 2007, the Criminal Cases Review Commission referred the case back to the Court of Appeal. They ruled that the original conviction was unsafe. The forensic evidence had been given far too much weight. A retrial was ordered. On December 14, 2007, Barry George stood in court and pleaded not guilty. This time, the particle evidence was ruled inadmissible. The prosecution had to build its case without it. They tried. They pointed to his history, his proximity to the scene, his strange behavior. But without that single speck of residue, there was nothing tying him to the murder. The defense reminded the jury that 3 women from a local disability center placed George at their offices around noon on the day of the killing. If their testimony was accurate, he couldn't have committed a murder at 11:30 and made it there in time. 2 neighbors who likely saw the real killer failed to identify George. On August 1, 2008, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty. Barry George walked out of prison after 8 years. He was 64 days short of serving a decade for a crime he didn't commit. But freedom didn't bring justice. George sought compensation. He claimed £1.4 million for the years stolen from him. The Ministry of Justice refused. Their reasoning was cold. Under British law, compensation requires proof that a new fact shows the defendant did not commit the offence beyond reasonable doubt. George hadn't proven his innocence, he'd only proven the evidence against him was flawed. In 2013, the High Court upheld the decision. Judges ruled he was not innocent enough to deserve a payout. The conviction had been reasonable at the time, they said. The appeal succeeded on a technicality. Barry George received nothing. "It makes me angry that they have taken 8 years of my life," he said afterwards. He moved to Ireland to escape the attention, to try and live quietly. But the damage was done. His name would forever be linked to a murder he didn't commit. And the real damage extended far beyond one man. For 8 years, while George sat in prison, the investigation to Jill Dando's murder went dormant. No new leads were pursued. No new suspects were investigated. The trail went ice cold. Whoever killed her had been given nearly a decade to disappear. The case was reopened after George's acquittal. Cold case detectives reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes. They concluded what many had suspected all along. Jill Dando was killed by a professional, a hard-contact execution. The gun pressed to her skull to muffle the sound and prevent blood splatter. This wasn't a stalker's impulsive act. This was calculated. This was trained.
Jill Dando spent years helping to catch criminals. 57 murderers, 53 rapists, 18 pedophiles, all captured because of a show she made famous. Her own killer has never spent a single day in court. They arrested the wrong man, convicted him on a speck of dust, let him rot for 8 years while the real murderer disappeared. Barry George lost a decade of his life and was told he wasn't innocent enough to deserve compensation. The fingerprints on that traffic light post have never been matched. The CCTV footage sat in boxes for decades.
A convicted killer in a Serbian prison looks exactly like the man seen fleeing the scene. When asked if he did it, he simply refused to answer. Someone knows what happened that morning. Maybe they've stayed silent out of fear, maybe out of loyalty, but they know. And unless they come forward, Jill Dando's killer will take that secret to their grave. The woman who helped solve crimes became Britain's greatest unsolved mystery. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. More cases like this are coming, and you won't want to miss them.